This new technique we're learning has a really ostentatious name. It's called one-point linear perspective. And it's applicable to any kind of architecture, but it also is relevant when you're talking about rows of trees and stuff like that. This is the photograph from which I'll be working, and we're not going to be doing a lot of detail. We're just getting the building blocks. So I'm going to convert it into black and white, and there you go. And there's a couple of key terms you're going to need to know. The first one is horizon line. So that's where the sky and the earth meet. It can also be called the eye line. That's when you look across something, it's at your head level, is the eye line or horizon line. The next thing you'll need to know is the vanishing point. The vanishing point is that dot. It kind of looks like the sun right now, and I'm highlighting it right there. So that's the point at which all things go to or vanish at. And it's kind of crazy, but you can see this happening in real life, that lines are obeying that vanishing point. They're all kind of angling the sides of the building, the lines on the street, even the row of cars. They're following that perspective, that rule that all lines kind of align up with a single vanishing point. All right, so let's look at the paper. This is what your paper should look like at this stage. You have your paper divided into 4 equal sections. The first section was dedicated to a pure landscape, which means that there was no man-made object in there. Now we're going to be focusing on a different rectangle. And honestly, it really doesn't matter which one you choose as long as you have one of those rectangles selected for your next thing, the next drawing. So we're first actually going to start off with a horizon line, and I'm going to be putting that on the bottom third of my paper. So I'm just going to, for the sake of showing you, I'm going to put another third up there. So you can see that the paper is divided into thirds vertically. So there's a top third, a middle third, and a bottom third. So I'm doing that because I want to show you that the horizon line should always be placed either on the bottom third line or on the top third. It's almost never a good idea in landscape to use the middle of your paper, so that halfway point in your paper, to work on either the top third or the bottom third, but never in the center. And I'm placing my vanishing point actually a little bit above the horizon line, and that's because I don't want the road to look like a triangle. Here's a close-up of the paper. You should see 2 lines and a dot, and that dot has to be positioned just above that lower third line. All right, so here's where we're going to need a ruler or a straight edge. So I'm going to be connecting that dot to the edge of the paper, not to the corner because that would be awkward, but to the side of the paper, just above that left-hand corner, that lower left-hand corner there. And notice how my fingers are positioned. So I'm holding down the ruler with at least 3 fingers. And I'm about to do another line on the opposite side. And again, above the corner there. That's going to be the edge of the road. And those 3 fingers held on the ruler help to keep it steady. If you only have 1 or 2 fingers, it's easy for the ruler to get wobbly. And I also like to hold the ruler kind of towards the middle of the ruler. So these are 2 parallel lines that are converging on the same vanishing point. Normally I would work in time lapse, but for this it's really complicated, so I'm just going to show you in real time. So that is going to be, that left-hand side is going to be the sidewalk and the street. And now I'm starting to put in the buildings. But I'm realizing that I wanted to make my line a little bit more vertical. So that line there is a vertical line. I'm just drawing it straight up. And you can tell if your line is a true vertical based off of the other picture, the edge of your other picture. So I'm aligning it with that left-hand edge of that landscape to make sure it's parallel and a true vertical. So that is going to be just a little piece of a building there. And these buildings do that thing that I was describing that helps to show space, and that is overlap. So one building's overlapping in front of another, similar to what you would see if you're looking down a street. So I'm going to be getting another vertical line parallel to that first one. And there's also a horizontal line. So here's the thing when you're using one-point perspective. One side of your object will not follow the rules of perspective, but the other side will. So one side will be horizontal on the side, and the other side has to go to your vanishing point. All right, so now I'm going to the top of the building. So basically, it's that second vertical line that we drew. So that line that I just drew goes right up to that vertical line there. So every right side of a building, or a block in this case, is going to go to that vanishing point. The left side does not have to obey that vanishing point. It can just be horizontal or vertical lines. So we are kind of doing buildings, but I want you to think of them as big blocks. And we are not putting on detail really, or at least not very much. I couldn't help myself. I did a little bit, but we're not putting windows or doors or any huge fancy architecture stuff, because I want to simplify that form. It gets more complicated. So all those lines can be confusing at first, and just realize that you're going to be erasing a lot of them out, which is why it's so critical to draw lightly. I also have a pencil sharpener nearby that I just like keep my pencils really sharp. So here is the side of another building. So it's essentially 3 buildings in a row down a street, but you can see that they're successively getting kind of smaller. Although that's not always the case, because sometimes you can have a small building and it's right next to a giant building. So that left side, I'm using only horizontal lines and verticals. I'm putting a little bit of a ledge there. You don't have to do that unless you want to. I just couldn't help myself. I had to do a little bit of fancy pants stuff. So I drew a line connecting the corner of that ledge to the VP, the vanishing point. And here's the parallel angle of that building. So it's all about parallel lines and lines that converge on the right side. And this stuff looks complicated, but if you do it enough, it'll start to make a lot of sense. In fact, you can see it in real life. So it's something that you can use whenever you draw, especially if you're doing something that has to do with buildings. But nature also obeys these rules too. Even clouds can obey the rules of linear perspective, where clouds get progressively smaller as they go back to the horizon. So that building that I just did there, it's an outline. It looks like it has cat ears. That is just a building that doesn't have any perspective. We're only going to see one front side. We're not going to see any other side of that building. So it's just the building head on. So now I'm going to erase some of those lines that we don't need. Remember, I drew that top third line in the beginning just to show you where a good placement is for the horizon, either on the top third, on the bottom third. But I'm going to start to erase that out so I can see the shape of the individual buildings. And you'll probably get a lot of eraser marks or like chunks from your eraser all over your paper. So you can kind of start to see the buildings take place. I'm just correcting a few lines, trying to make it make a little bit more sense. And there were some trees in here, and I'm going to throw those in because I like the idea of something organic, something like a tree that has its own unique shape, contrasting with the man-made stuff. So the man-made stuff being the buildings. This is actually a scene of San Francisco, and there's some interesting trees there. They've been kind of shaped and sculpted by the winds and the fog and that salty air. I always feel like trees kind of give some life to architecture. And we talk about having different types of texture in art to give variety. This is one way you can do that. You've got the harsh lines of the building juxtaposed against the texture of the plants. So that's a plant too. It's in between some buildings. It was like a thicket of plants there. And you can see that I use pretty faithfully that idea of once I put my pencil down on the paper, I don't lift it up again until I'm done when I'm drawing plants. I mean, I occasionally do, but I really find that that helps me to describe the plant shape better, and I'm looking at the edge of the shape of the plant as I'm drawing. And those are some plants too, to the left there, or to the right. So things like telephone poles and train tracks all follow that rule of one-point linear perspective. And that was something that was discovered by the Renaissance artists. Before then, the medieval artists really didn't have a handle on perspective. They were trying. There's some really interesting and quite beautiful attempts at perspective, but they're not 100% accurate. There's some mistakes there. And the thing about perspective is that even a non-trained artist can look at a perspective drawing or a drawing that has perspective in it, and they can see that something's wrong. They may not be able to identify exactly what's wrong about it, but they can see that there's some mistakes. So it's the kind of thing that you want to try and get down rather accurately. And this is just one method. You can also do it a different way, but we are going to try this method first, which is, again, with rulers or a straight edge to that singular vanishing point. And I don't like to teach you guys anything that I don't think is necessary, so this is a skill that I actually feel is helpful. Now, I know I use it all the time in my art because I do draw a lot of buildings. And if you're interested in interior scenes like a living room or a bedroom, you'd have to understand those rules of linear perspective. Just cleaning things up a bit. I'm gearing up to put in some shadow shapes because there's some interesting cast shadows happening. This picture was taken right around sunset. So what's cool about that is because the buildings are so close, the cast shadows are falling onto the building next door, the neighboring building. So we're seeing that on the sides of the buildings, which is really interesting. Again, just cleaning up some of my lines. I'm going to go ahead and leave that vanishing point there, just the dot, but I'm going to erase the lines that are tethered to it. So now we get to put in a little bit of shading. And this is kind of one of my favorite parts when we're working on the drawing. We put in the shading because it really helps to push the volume, and you can really get a sense of what's happening with the drawing and if the drawing is going to work or not. And I think I told you guys this, but these small drawings are what artists use all the time before committing to doing a painting. They'll do several sketches. They're called thumbnail sketches, this size or smaller. And they're not polished drawings. They're kind of rough, quick sketches, but they give a sense of light and dark. and they inform the artist about the composition, whether that composition is going to work or not. And when I say composition, that means how things are arranged within that picture. So that left side is actually the edge of a building. And remember, the rule is that things that are closer tend to be darker. I'm actually going to push that even darker. I'm taking a 4B pencil and pushing that even darker. Sometimes with artists, they'll actually exaggerate that to help push the perspective. That means to kind of push that idea of space and depth. So instead of trying to convey like 100 feet, you're trying to convey 500 feet or a quarter of a mile. Perspective's cool because it kind of feels like you could be there and your eye wants to follow that path to the vanishing points. And there is that cast shadow from the opposite building, and it's falling across the side of the neighboring building. And I would kind of follow the value pattern that you see in the photograph. And I'm deliberately making the front side of this building, the side that's facing the street, a shade darker than the side of it. I think that's correct when compared to the picture. And for each plane of the building, for each side, I'm trying to go the same direction with my stroke. And I put that little like cylindrical shape on there too. It's because the building actually had that. I couldn't resist. But you could make it plain. You could just make it into a cube, like a box. Just going to give that some shape. Some volume to it. So I'm not going to have you shade this whole thing in today because I think it would take a little bit too much of our time. But I am going to have you submit this. I actually would prefer you to submit it before you do your shading on there. So I'd like you to submit it in the outline stage. That way if there's some things that need to be corrected, then I can help you out before you actually commit to shading. This stuff is tricky, so don't hesitate to ask for help. You're always welcome to turn it in before it's actually finished for some feedback.